Thank you, everyone, for joining us this afternoon. Really appreciate it. I understand that it's a really busy time of the semester, so thank you so much for joining this conversation. What I hope will be a dialogue in regards to EAL, English as an Additional Language, teaching and learning. And I'm hoping that people will gather up some questions that they have. And I am really casual about this. If you would like to ask a question in between on a particular slide, I'm happy to take questions. So please, no formality here. Just make yourselves comfortable. Lots of food, and hopefully we can get into a great conversation throughout. So my name is Ina Lee. I'm an assistant professor in the Faculty of Education here at SFU. My field of research is English as an Additional Language, specifically at the post-secondary level. And so I teach a number of courses here, including being one of the, currently the acting coordinator of the Foundations of Academic Literacy, which is like our first year composition course, but also teaching EAL pedagogy, theory and pedagogy courses across B.Ed all the way to grad level. So I'll be bringing in things that are from my research, but also from things that are within the field and within our research. So the talk today is going to be called Problematizing, quote, Common Sense Discourses of English as an Additional Language. To situate this, I do want to talk about how, sorry, can we move it a tiny bit over? Sorry about that. Thanks. School talk, which is a term that's being devised by Michael Pollock, who's an anti-racist educator or anti-oppressive educator, school talk is populated with, quote, common sense folk beliefs, which can be detrimental both within the classroom and beyond. So Michael Pollock talks about school talk in relation to the kinds of conversations and discourses, not just talk verbally, but also the ways in which talk happens in and through things like policy documents and curriculum. So this idea that school talk is a really big part of the ways in which schools function. These are the ways in which teachers talk about students. They guide the ways in which people are teaching their courses, what they teach, how they teach. So this idea of school talk is not just things like labeling students, naming assessments, all of those things, but it's pretty much the idea of school discourse. So what is the discursive or the kinds of conversations that are had about school and about people that are in that school? So teachers, students, and things like that. Who is, who are EALs, who are below average, who is not meeting expectations, who are at risk, and all of these kinds of constructions. So this kind of school talk is often populated with common sense. And when we talk about common sense discourses, I'm talking about common sense discourses in terms of folk views. So everyday beliefs or attitudes that people have about a subject. So for example, things like folk science, or folk medicine. So things that people believe in popular discourse or overall in societal discourse about a certain topic. Sometimes folk discourse can be reflective of what the research says. So it's not that folk discourse is wholly incorrect, but oftentimes folk discourse can also be incommensurate with what actual research and discourse says. So these are kind of like the things that the everyday beliefs that people might have, for example, about EAL learners, is that if you talk really loud and articulate really carefully, or you repeat yourself the same words, then you can increase comprehension. So things like that. Or some of the other folk discourses are going to be the ones that I will actually identify in my common sense. So these are things that people think, oh, okay, that makes sense, because if maybe they can't hear you, or maybe if you speak really slowly, it will help them to pick up sounds, and that's what the issue is. So these are things that we need to think about, because oftentimes when we talk about discourses have a dual possibility of both describing but also constituting or creating knowledge and understanding about something. So the ways that we talk about somebody, something, a topic, are not just reflective of creating a reality around that. It also is about creating that reality in and of itself is being created in our minds through our talk. So school talk and any talk is really, really important. This is the importance of discourse, language and discourse and language and power. So in terms of folk linguistics specifically, so folk linguistics are beliefs that may be held very strongly despite a lack of expert knowledge, or they may even be in conflict with a current professional position. To ignore such beliefs handicaps the language teaching and learning process at nearly every step of the way. So this was actually a special issue in Journal of Applied Linguistics, where folk linguistics was actually the special topics, because the question, because when we oftentimes talk as linguists about education, teaching, and learning, we're talking about the things that we believe, things that research shows. But if we don't focus on the ways in which linguistics is talked about by non-linguists, then we're missing whole understandings of why things happen the way that they do, right? There's this kind of break in conversation, right? So it's important for us to actually understand how is it that people talk about ESL? What are these folk linguistic beliefs? Because these are actually what are implicated in things that are happening in our classrooms. Therefore, a critical analysis of folk linguistics or folk discourses in any field are necessary, as the impacts of these discourses can oftentimes be detrimental. So one of the most common ones I hear is when instructors, professors, faculty say, I'm not an ESL teacher, I don't teach language, I teach biology, or I teach history, or I teach math, right? So I'm not an ESL teacher, I don't teach language, I teach math. However, in linguistics, or even logically, we cannot separate language and content. You cannot teach content without language, and language is taught through content. Fundamentally, they're interrelated, right? So content in school context is always presented and assessed through language. As the difficulty of the concepts we want students to learn increases, the language that construes these concepts also become more complex and distanced from ordinary uses of language. So there is actually a difference between the language, the way it's used in disciplines in the university, and how we talk outside of the university, right? We don't talk this way out. Well, some of us might, but they're not quite, it's a little bit unorthodox, right? We talk very differently outside. The language and terminologies we use are very different, right? So such an understanding that inside schools are very different than the ways we talk outside schools implies that focus on language itself is important for helping students learn the concepts of school subjects or disciplines. All teachers are teachers of language in this sense. So Mary Schlepper-Grell actually talks about this as the language of schooling, which is a very specific type of language. And it's a type of language that we learn in school, and it's a type that we use in school, and it's a type of language that people need in order to succeed in school, because it's not just like you can take whatever regular language out there and bring it into the university, into your disciplines, right? There's a very specialized language. The second thing, in light of that then we need to also make the recognition, and applied linguistics makes the recognition, that academic English is no one's native language. Regardless of whether you're a first language speaker of English or not, learning the language of biology, learning the language of science as an additional language, history as an additional language. Everybody is a quote-unquote non-native speaker, even the monolingual English speaker. These are not languages that are used outside of the school that they've used before, so they're learning the language in the same ways that any language user will be using. And what John Swales talks about is discourse communities. We're part of different discourse communities, the discourse community of history, discourse community of math, and you join membership into those communities, and these are specific communities within school. So what are the implications of this particular common sense misunderstanding? Is that we therefore need to be explicit about teaching disciplinary language in every course that we teach. As teaching language is beneficial to all learners, not just ESL learners. So when we talk about, I don't want to be teaching language, or I don't teach language, well, know that it's not just the quote-unquote EAL learners that are actually being left behind. It is also that other students for whom they've never taken biology at a 300-400 level, they're also going to be left behind. You cannot teach content without teaching language fundamentally. So this is how this belief, this common sense belief, can be detrimental to teaching and learning for everyone. A second common sense misunderstanding is that TOEFL, IELTS, and any other standardized language tests are accurate predictors of EAL learning success in the university. And this one is a bit controversial because we all know that SFU, UBC, all universities actually use standard language, English language testings for admissions into the university. However, that's actually part of the common sense myth, because actually there is a lot of research in applied linguistics that shows that standardized language tests and high scores in them do not necessarily equate with university success. The reason being is because standardized language tests are oftentimes based on decontextualized language skills and grammatical accuracy. But it's not just grammatical accuracy or decontextualized language skills devoid of a discipline that actually can indicate, because you're going to be in disciplinary studies. You're going to be focusing on high-level specialized terminology. And grammar, perfect grammar, is not going to be the end-all and be-all, right? If you don't know the terminology, it doesn't matter what your grammar looks like, right? So it doesn't actually show whether somebody has the potential for advanced disciplinary engagement across the levels, okay? And second of all, standard language tests are not strong predictors of academic success, in that oftentimes standardized language tests are not necessarily valid in terms of their assessments. They may not necessarily test what they're saying that they're testing, or oftentimes language tests are designed for particular reasons, and then they become over-applied by institutions like the government or by schools in ways that the test designers never expected them to be used, and actually don't endorse those kinds of usages, right? So there's, by the way, this PowerPoint will be available on the CELLTR website. Absolutely. Inter-rater reliability is a huge issue within these standardized tests. You know, as much as they spend a lot of time on standardization, I agree, much of the research shows that inter-rater reliability, as in who's getting trained to mark these tests and whether there's reliability across these large test groups, has been found to be absolutely problematic. Thank you. Exactly. So for so many reasons, these are problematic gauges. So the implication of this common sense myth is that we need to rely less on standardized language tests and more on linguistically situated, so situated within content, not decontextualized content, so linguistically situated formative as well as summative assessments. So not just tests at the very end in sum, but also throughout formative language. And that just also makes good sense, but in assessment theory, that is the key, right? We're not just testing at the very end after week 12. We're actually testing all the way through, and we're looking at culminations of knowledge acquisition and socialization, right? The third one, a language learner's linguistic production is reflective of their intellectual ability. So actually in my mind, I was thinking that when I did these PowerPoints, I should push a button and then there's a big like X in between, right? Just to show that no, these are false, because all of these in green are false. And obviously all of the things down here are explicating how they're false and what the research shows. So a language learner's linguistic production, so what they produce either in reading, writing, speaking, or listening, is reflective of intellectual ability. And I would hope that all of us understand that that's not the case, okay? Just because someone doesn't produce something doesn't necessarily mean they don't have that or they inherently cannot. So language proficiency and production are, in applied linguistics, they'll theorize that it's impacted by a myriad of factors outside of cognitive processes. So for example, how they're feeling, what are their investments in the course, whether they want to be there, what are their interpersonal relationships with the students, with the instructor, okay? So things like that, whether they've eaten, whether they didn't sleep because they were tending to family members or they were being translators for their families in family emergencies. So all of these other things, there's so many things, okay? Multilingual, and in fact, the research shows that multilingual or bilingual ability is actually often associated with more complex cognition. So actually there is testing all the way and research all the way from the 70s and 80s that actually show that people with stronger language skills and multiple language skills actually do better They actually do better in school. They actually have higher language production in multiple languages, and the actual cognition and the actual engagement in cognition is actually much more enhanced. It's much more dynamic because they're able to use different parts of their brains in much more dynamic and complex ways, actually. So there is actually research that shows that. So what are the implications of this misunderstanding? We need to disassociate language ability from overall ability, but also we need to improve the ways in which we assess. So we do not make these judgments that people cannot produce. Oftentimes the reasons why students cannot produce or they don't produce well is oftentimes because the assessment in and of itself is flawed, either in its content or its the way that it is actually being tested. The modes of the testing might not actually be commensurate with how best we can assess certain content or certain ideas or certain skills. Okay. The next one, a language learner's ability to converse, so speaking and listening in English, is commensurate with their ability to read and write in the language. Unfortunately, you cannot transfer what you hear in spoken English to whether or not a student has strong written skills. Fundamentally, in most research will show that listening and speaking often precede the acquisition of reading and writing being a much more complex skill in some ways, but also, especially in a university setting where reading and writing is much more disciplinarily complex, this is also why. So they might be able to speak everyday conversation and be able to talk about these things, but writing it is a whole different ballgame, because when you write it, there's much different expectations in writing than in speaking that are much more confined. Therefore, the criteria for what is constituted as strong writing is much more challenging than how spoken English is assessed. Okay? So this is actually what Jim Cummins back in the 80s talked about, BICS versus CALP, so basic interpersonal communication skills, which is kind of like your everyday communication skills, and cognitive academic language proficiency. Jim Cummins has moved on from here, but generally we still recognize that there is some distinction. However, it is also important to know that applied linguists such as Shondell Nero has actually worried when we over-compartmentalize the difference between BICS and CALP, because in fact, BICS and CALP actually do interrelate to help in language acquisition. They're not as separate as it was originally theorized. But Jim Cummins has kind of pulled back from his kind of dichotomy view of it. So he's been a bit more holistic, but just so you're aware. Okay? Also, it is important to understand that not all EAL students are international students or immigrants. Actually, EAL students can be domestic students. They can be students that are actually born and raised in Vancouver, who might actually be living in multilingual families who operate on a daily basis in a language other than English. So spoken English might be less problematic, but reading and writing might not necessarily be the types of the language in which they engage in on their daily basis, even if they were born here. Okay? So basically the idea is that we need to remember that, especially in a diverse city like Vancouver specifically, the EAL, who is an English language learner, is exceptionally heterogeneous. There is no one fit. And there's much research that actually shows that the more we conflate EAL as only international, only those born out of country, we're actually missing the language needs of a very broad group of people who live in an inherently globalized, multilingual, and multicultural world. Okay? So we're serving all students. They're not just international students nor immigrants. These are false, oftentimes used as false categories in many ways, either policy-wise or politically. So what is the implication here? We need to avoid language learner essentializations and understanding the diversity of language needs. So not only are there diverse language learners, it also means that there are going to be different gaps, the different kinds of needs that they will be needing, and how those needs need to be met depending on what language skills they're coming from, or what language backgrounds, or whatever their context is in their daily lives, even outside of school. What is their language trajectory and language history? Another myth. If you speak or write a language, such as English, you can teach English. So all people who speak English can be great teachers of English. I wish that were true. Unfortunately, That's not always the case. It's not to say that just because you are a native speaker of English, you can't be a good teacher, only that there is much research in teacher education, in ESL theory and applied linguistics theory, that say that just because you grew up speaking language doesn't mean you can teach the language. And if you think about it this way, I think about it like this. Hey, I grew up using math. I use math every day. I calculated how much my sandwich was going to cost, whatever. Doesn't mean I can teach that, right? So it is important to understand that ESL is a disciplinary field of inquiry with a robust body of research, and that there are common sense beliefs about educational theory and practice that can oftentimes be counter to educational research. That said, I appreciate that I'm talking with people who are here, which kind of tells me that your meta-awareness of that is already there. And this is the thing. We're trying to figure out what are the best ways rather than falling into what do we think might be the best ways, or what do other people tell us that might not necessarily be based on applied linguistics research. So basically, this is almost like this is more of actually a policy thing, a requirement for deans, for department heads, and for administrators, for the president, is there needs to be investing in EAL professional development, such as the kinds of things that we try to do here in CELLTR, in order for people to understand EAL and theoretical and pedagogical knowledge, in order to facilitate English language learning, to facilitate this kind of really advanced English language learning that is situated in specific rhetoric, so rhetorical socializations into different disciplinary subjects, ways of speaking in ways that are considered scholarly or academic. Okay, so basically, that's something I would like you to take back, if possible, to all of your managers, administrators, because that's the biggest thing. This underinvestment in us as educators that are not meeting the students' needs, but also are not meeting our needs when we don't have the support to be able to help the students, because that makes our jobs much more difficult. And I hear that all the time about teachers wanting, instructors wanting to know, how can we best meet these students' needs? And you're doing things that may not necessarily be helpful to your students, but actually they're also not helpful to you in terms of time efficiency, understanding best bang for your buck of how you can take the less amount of time to actually do more to assist. And so actually the next workshops that I will be heading will also be going into some of those practices of how do you reduce your contact time and actually improve significantly your educational pedagogy for yourself and your students, right? Next one. Native speakers of English are the best teachers of English. And this is also for actually the policy level. Oftentimes I hear this from deans and from administration saying that they get a lot of complaints from their students that non-native teachers are not good English teachers, or they can't be. And actually all of the research also shows that this generally is false, depending on what subject they're teaching. Obviously, on the assumption that the quote-unquote non-native speaker has disciplinary knowledge, having disciplinary knowledge, you know, versus being a completely fluent native speaker, that's kind of a crapshoot. I would rather get the person who actually has disciplinary knowledge, especially at the university level. And so these are also based on sociopolitical constructions of native and non-native speaker. So that's a whole other thing about interpersonal relationships and understandings of diversity and inclusion in a multicultural world. On top of that, however, in applied linguistics, the native English-speaking teacher and non-native English-speaking teacher construction, also known as nest and nest, they're actually contested linguistic categories. In linguistics, many applied linguists are actually saying that this is a social construction. It's not actually a linguistic construction. Because basically when we look at the ways in which people are using English in the world, English is in many ways a global language, and there are many people who come from different countries, and the English might sound different, but it's no less English than English in North America. It's just a different type of English, right? So what we need to do then is also, in recognizing that English is actually an international language, a global language, this idea that we need to de-emphasize prescriptive grammar and language, and we need to re-emphasize descriptive. So when we talk about descriptive versus prescriptive, descriptive is language as it's actually used and studied in linguistics. However, prescriptive is when we tell students, don't start your sentence with because. Don't start a sentence with and. These are just aesthetic preferences. And these actually, again, are not based on language or linguistics, right? So again, it's important for us to expand our ideas of what English is. And if language in the linguistic sense is based on communication and effective communication, speaking English in a particular way does not always equate with more comprehensible or more intelligible language, okay? So we need to position non-native English speakers as valuable resources. They also have lived experiences within their own disciplinary language learning trajectories, considering they actually went through much more meta-linguistic awareness and meta-linguistic understanding and learning to teach, actually. Oftentimes for quote-unquote native speakers like us, we actually learn these just by kind of osmosis or naturally. They're actually not meta-linguistic or meta-awareness, but actually when non-native quote-unquote language non-native speakers are actually teaching disciplinary knowledge, they actually have the advantage of they themselves going through meta-language awareness and meta-linguistic awareness. So they actually can be better teachers. Next one, English-only environments provide the most effective context for English learning. Unfortunately, oftentimes administrators will say we should have English-only policies or we should only speak English because immersion and submersion is the best way. Throw people off of the deep end. Unfortunately, however, again, applied linguistics research does not support this. Applied linguistics research actually shows that submersion and immersion actually limit rather than enhance linguistic strategies and processes. Because basically, when you're at least at the university level, when we have students here at SFU, they've gone through language learning. They've learned other languages before. If they're able to use their repertoires from their home languages or other languages, they can transfer the meta-awareness. This is actually the advantage that adults have. English only might be different for children. There are other reasons why English only might be more ideal for younger children in immersive environments, but then there's also issues about kind of like personal identity. But at least for adults, we should be allowing multilingual practices. So we don't necessarily, one of the questions is, okay, how do we assess that? So here's the question. Do we have to say, like, if I don't speak the language or don't use that language, how can I assess that? But it's not actually about that. It's about using letting the students use their languages as part of their scaffolding. So for example, what we do in FALX 99 is we will allow them to put notes, do their notes and pre-writing in whatever language. You can actually do your drafts and add little annotation notes. If you're giving feedback to somebody else and you happen to have the same language, then you can actually you can give your feedback verbally or written in that language. Whatever will help to better enhance the understanding of the content is the point. Restricting somebody's language is not going to be helpful. It's like saying for certain students, if you're going to do math, you can't use a calculator. Okay, sometimes, yes, you don't want to use a calculator in testing, maybe, but in other ways, what's the issue? If using a calculator helps to understand the content and process that metacognition, that is actually a tool that you are actually eliminating from the person's toolbox to actually help them to learn overall. So, also, however, if we have English-only environments, especially in a globalized multicultural world, and supposedly Canada is supposed to be a multicultural country, we are actually implying that students are not legitimate members of this community because they don't speak English, right? And so when we're even talking about diversity and inclusion, that is fundamentally an issue. It can lead to institutional isolation and marginalization, which contradicts the supports that are needed for effective language learning, right? And Ilana Lecky has done an excellent study, a longitudinal study over 4 years in the US, and she actually interviewed over 1,000 students, but she also had focus students, and these were all in universities, at the university level, and she talks about the importance of what she called socio-academic relationships. And this is a category of social interaction with peers and faculty that proved to be critical to the students' sense of satisfaction with their educational work, and sometimes even the possibility of doing that work. And so this idea of what are even the socio-academic relationships that students have with the secretary, the admin assistant, the lab technician, all of these are relationships that can help or hinder, right? And so this is not just about language even. This is also about fundamentally about relationships. And these kinds of relationships that actually help to mediate language learning and educational trajectories. So the implication, respecting and encouraging multilingual practices and equitable inclusion as essential for successful language learning. Focusing on grammar instruction and grammatical accuracy is the most important factor for language learner success in universities. So unfortunately, this also doesn't hold weight, especially when we're going into more advanced language learning. Language learners' needs shift over the course of a language trajectory. So Schleppergrell in The Language of Schooling talks about how knowledge develops in particular contexts related to particular purposes, and the specific context and purposes shape the knowledge and linguistic resources to construe that knowledge that the students develop. Because each discipline, however, has evolved a way of using language in particular disciplinary ways that interprets the world in its own particularly disciplinary terms, students need to learn the language of the different school disciplines if they are to be effective in doing school-based tasks. So we have students who are taking breadth courses, right? They're not just taking their courses for their major. They're fundamentally taking breadth courses. So they're learning, and they're required to learn multiple disciplinary languages, right? And so the ways that you learn those languages are very different. The ways we engage in it, the ways that they learn in sciences might actually be in biology or chemistry, might be tactile through lab doings and talking through lab things, talking through the language of observation. Whereas something like in business, it's a very business language. They'll be doing it by doing lab reports, doing kind of marketing spiels, those kinds of things, which is a different way of using language. So the language learners' needs will shift across their education, their language trajectories. And so focusing just on grammar is not going to be the most helpful. And we assume, hopefully, that grammar generally, people have a foundation where we can build on as we build on disciplinary language use. So academic success, however, is also not just about academic literacy. There are oftentimes multiple co-occurring and non-linguistic barriers impacting educational success. So even finances, family issues, personal health issues, and things like that. So we need to recognize that language learning is a lifelong process rather than a problem that can be fixed by one-off interventions and error correction. Okay, going on to my 9th one. Okay, this one. EAL learners want to learn English and are happy to do so. This one is oftentimes surprising when I talk with my teachers, when I'm talking with teachers in the Faculty of Education, whether they're pre-service or whether they're master's teachers who also teach in a school. Oftentimes we want to think that people are here for this love of learning. They love sciences, they love math. They're here at SFU because they want to kind of learn to be in an English situation or in an English university. They want to know what it's like to live in another country. And unfortunately, the research also shows that's not actually the case. Some learners want to learn English, and some are happy to do so. How many, however, are ambivalent about English and are learning the language for reasons that are not always happy. And there have been many, many case studies. Now, since the late 1980s and 90s, when identity and language learning became quite a big theoretical framework and analytical framework, the reasons why people learn English are very, very, very varied, and some of them are not great. People are doing it sometimes because they are actually seeking refuge or asylum. Some of them are doing it because they're forced to by their parents. Some of them are doing it because they're not able to get into particular schools that they need to get to. So there's particular capital and prestige that comes with learning in a English-speaking country that has nothing to do with the quality of that or in and of itself. English has capital. Language learners' investments in a language impact their everyday interactions, and that's important for us to understand, because when you can imagine, if you are not invested in something wholeheartedly, or you are actually coming in resenting why you are there, that will fundamentally impact your everyday interactions. So I do always want to point out to instructors, yes, it is about us as instructors. However, it's not just about that. And as ethical instructors, and who are wanting to help, it's important for us to get to understand or have more complex understandings of what bring our students to SFU, because it's not always why we think that they're here. And that's a huge kind of change in mindset for a lot, because they're like, why? What do you mean? I am a world famous professor who teaches that. And I'm like, no. That's not always the case. Sorry, it's not always about you, right? And so these are things that we really have to think about, right? We need to fundamentally, the implication is understand that language learning isn't just about language. It's not just about the language, which actually leads me to my last one. English language education is a neutral endeavor. Many people think that language is neutral, language is apolitical. So language teaching is neutral or apolitical, but especially in 2019, in this globalized world, English is a language of power, and and much research in language policy and educational policy in Canada, and also not just everywhere in the United States, but also in Canada. Monica Heller's done some excellent work for many decades on this. She talks about, and the research has shown, how academic institutions are regulatory spaces of language use and language learning. We fundamentally, other than the government, schools are the biggest regulators of language practice. So when I'm talking about that, what does that mean? We're talking about things like requiring standard English, or whatever fictional standard English that is, or requiring monolingualism or linguistic containment when we say only use English. You can only write in English. Please don't use anything other than English. Or things like well-writtenness. So there's been some great work in rhetoric and composition by Joan Turner, who talks about this notion of when people are assessing English language learners' writing, they talk about, I want it to be well-written. But this idea of well-written has oftentimes no actual rigorous foundation. It's just about what feels right. What are our aesthetic preferences for how language should be used as native speakers, the way we like it to be used, the way we use it, right? Or the way that we think people should be using it. So in terms of language policy in higher education, Shauna Shapiro in the United States writes, many institutions have articulated a strong commitment to cultural diversity, socioeconomic equity, and global citizenship. Yet they treat linguistic minority students, who fit quite well with this vision, as institutional aliens. It is incumbent upon us as teachers, scholars, and activists to highlight this institutional hypocrisy and to call for a more ethical and effective treatment of linguistic minority students. So she's doing this work in language advocacy in the United States. And again, it gets back to even the previous slide, where language is not just about linguistic communication. Language and power, the power of English, the commodification of English, the marketization of English. English is very desirable in international fields, right? And so our implication as educators and policymakers in the university is that we need to more effectively support EAL students' educational experiences and trajectories. And that means recognizing that there are diverse needs that change over time, that are never going to go away because we're always continuing to use language. But the diverse needs are not just limited to linguistic needs. We're also looking at what are the institutional needs, what are the cultural needs, what are the financial, the health and wellness needs. All of these are part of the academic relationships. All of this is about creating an environment, a diverse, equitable environment that helps students to achieve all that they can achieve. So just as a review, common sense misunderstandings of EAL education. So these are all false myths. One, I'm not an EAL teacher. I don't teach language. I teach name of subject. Two, TOEFL, IELTS, and other standardized language tests are accurate predictors of EAL learning success in university. Not true. Three, language learners' linguistic production is reflective of their intellectual ability. Not true. Four, Language learners' ability to converse and speaking and listening English is commensurate with their ability to read, write in the language. Again, also not true, or not wholly true for them. If you speak or write a language, you can teach that language. Not always true. 6, native speakers of English are the best teachers of English. Not always true. 7, English-only environments provide the most effective context for learning English. Not always true. 8, focusing on grammar instruction and grammatical accuracy is the most important factor for language learner success in university. Also not true. 9, EAL learners want to learn English and are happy to do so. Unfortunately not true. And 10, English language education is a neutral endeavor. And with 1 to 9 being false, we can see pretty clearly why number 10 is also false. Thank you. Questions, comments, concerns, ruminations, observations, lived experiences. I did want to purposely make a shorter presentation, so we do have about 40 minutes. Is it 40 minutes for questions? And I am aware that people have very busy schedules, so if you need to leave, I'm totally fine with that as well. So my email is here as well, and again, CELLTR will be putting these online. And of course, if there's things that come up, questions that come up, I'm happy for you to email me.